Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact video series. My name is Ryan Duffy and I'm the director of the museum. And this week we're going to do something a little bit different than what we've done in the past, and it's going to be purely a history lesson on things from the county's past. And this week I thought it would be nice to talk about the early development of our towns, how they first got started, and where their names came from and how we know them today. So we're going to go through each town and a few of the villages and hamlets with some importance, and how they got their names and how they were first established. So you'll get to listen to a nice little history lesson as we go through this, and hopefully learn a little bit more about our local communities. So first off, we have Alabama, which is in the northwest corner of the county. And Alabama is one of a town that was split off from others. It was formed from Shelby in Orleans County and from Oakfield, in parts of Oakfield here in Genesee County, on April 17th, 1826. It was originally called Garyville, after Elbridge Gerry, who was an ex-vice president and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. On April 21st, 1828, the name was changed to Alabama, which is actually a Native American term, which loosely translated it means "here we rest." And it also has some reference to the state of Alabama, and that the state actually predates our town of Alabama in terms of naming. So there is a connection there. Next, we're going to move on to Alexander, which was first settled by a man named Alexander Ray in 1802, as he has the first recorded deed, and actually the town ends up being named after him, after his first name though, instead of his last name, which is a little bit different in terms of the naming of towns in our area. Now, Alexander was split off from Batavia on June 12th, 1812, and the village of Alexander was actually incorporated in 1834. Now we'll move on to Batavia. So we have both the village/city of Batavia and the town of Batavia. Now, the town of Batavia goes back to the very beginning of the development of the Holland Purchase, as originally the entire purchase was split into 4 towns, with the easternmost one being Batavia. So it actually ran all the way from Lake Ontario to the Pennsylvania border originally, and pretty much to the edge of Genesee County as we know it today. So a huge area, but the town as we know it shrunk way to a large degree over time. But the history of Batavia can really date back to 1801, when Joseph Ellicott first came to this spot and essentially made it the center of the land office purchases, and eventually established the land office here in order to sell to settlers. Now, he chose the name Batavia in honor of his Dutch financiers, as it actually is a name that goes way back into Dutch history, even back to the Roman times, as the initial people who came to what became the Netherlands were called the BATAVIA by the Romans, and Batavia became their area, and it means better lands in terms of a translation to English. But it wasn't actually the first choice in names, as Ellicott wanted to name it after Paulo Busti, his boss, direct boss, so they almost went with Boostiville. And then Busti wanted to name it after Joseph Ellicott, so they almost went with Ellicottstown before eventually settling on Batavia. Now, the town was established right away, and the village eventually comes in about the next year, about 1802, and your first settlers come in right after, people such as James Brisbane opening up the general store and post office, as well as other very early settlers. But it does become a city until 1915, so we're actually known as the village of Batavia about as long as we've been known as the city of Batavia. So next we have Bergen, which has a little bit of a different beginnings, as it actually wasn't initially part of the Holland Purchase, but was part of a few other tracts that eventually kind of get incorporated. It was actually part of the Triangular Tract and the Connecticut Tract. So portions of Bergen that were part of the Triangular Tract were actually bought from Joseph Ellicott, as he became the agent for that area as well. But if your land was part of the Connecticut Tract, you bought from Levi Ward, who was set up in Bergen. Now, the town was actually formed on April 2nd, 1813, and it was actually from the town of Murray originally, and it was called Northwoods, at least early on, but the name changed to Bergen, which is actually in reference to a city in Norway, Bergen, a little bit different pronunciation. And there's also a city in New Jersey with a very similar name, but goes back to Norway, actually. Next we have Bethany, which is one of the earlier towns to split off. Actually split off from Batavia on June 8th, 1812, and is actually, the name comes from a biblical past, as it's in reference to the Bethany of Judea. So you can see we've had several different sources of inspiration for town names already, and now we have our first biblical name. The next town is Byron. Now, Byron actually split off from Bergen on April 4th, 1820, and it's actually named after the renowned English poet Lord George Noel Gordon Byron, or as we know him, Lord Byron, but sort of a unique person to name the town after. But again, he was very popular at the time, so probably somebody started reading Lord Byron and thought we should name the town after him. So next we have Darien, which the earliest settlers to the area that we know of, about 1803. One prominent one was Stephen King, who actually came to the area in 1815 to what we know as Darien Center today, and established his store and tavern, which was known as King's Corners, for quite a while. Until 1832, the town was actually called South Pembroke and was associated more with Pembroke than on its own. It was actually formed that year on April 3rd, and it was named after an early Spanish name for the Gulf between Panama and Colombia down in the Gulf of Mexico. This area was actually an attempt by Scottish colonial forces to establish a Scottish colony down in South America. So it's actually called the Straits of Darien. However, the first name that we have in record goes back to the Native Americans of the area, where they called it Oso-Antega, or place of turkeys. The next town we'll talk about is ELBA, which actually formed from Batavia on March 14th, 1820. And it originally actually included the town of Oakfield, which then split off again. And the first settlement was at Dawes Corners, which became the village of ELBA in 1801. And the town of ELBA actually gets its name from Napoleonic history, as the island that Napoleon was first exiled to before he came back again was Elba, out in the Atlantic. And apparently the town supporters wanted to name it after that. But however, it took a long time for the village of Elba to be incorporated, as that did not happen until 1884. So now we'll move on to Leroy, and this is one of our areas of Genesee County that probably has some of the earliest settlement, along with Stafford. The earliest settler was Charles Wilbur, who arrived in 1797, and he chose the area, which is right around where the village eventually popped up, for its accessibility to various water features, as well as it was on the major trails of the time. And it was actually the westernmost settlement of the Phelps-Gorham Mill Acre Tract, so it was about as far west as you were going in New York at the time. The following year, Captain John Ganson arrived, and he expanded the settlement, and it actually became known as Ganson's, named after him. Now, it was actually part of the town of Northampton, which was a very large area at the time, part of Ontario and then Genesee County, which a lot of these towns actually split off from very early on. Eventually, it was named the town of Bologna, which is actually the Roman goddess of victory, and actually came about right at the beginning of War of 1812 on June 8th, 1812. And this town included Pavilion, Leroy, and the eastern part of Stafford. However, the name did not last very long, and in the following year, on April 6th, they changed the name to Leroy after Herman Leroy, who was one of the early settlers, but also a prominent landowner who was selling the land of the area. The next town we have is Oakfield. Now, the first settlers in what we know as Oakfield actually came about 1801, and they established a settlement called Plainbrook, which was actually built on the site of an old Native American settlement in that same area. Now, the town of Oakfield doesn't actually come into existence until 1842, when it splits off from Elba, so it's actually one of the later towns we have in Genesee County. Now, the village of Oakfield that we know today was called Plainbrook, eventually changes its name to Caryville in 1837 after Colonel Alfred Cary, who built the first store and was a prominent citizen early on. However, when the village was incorporated in 1858, it changed its name to Oakfield, and this is probably due to the large amount of oak trees that were in the area. Next, we have Pavilion, which until 1817 was actually part of Leroy and then Covington. However, in 1841, when Wyoming County split away from Genesee County, Covington was sort of on that borderline and actually got split itself, with the southern part staying with Wyoming County and the northern part becoming what we know as Pavilion. However, it didn't get that name until the following year, in 1842. And then when the town formed, southern parts of Stafford and Leroy were actually incorporated into it. Now, Pavilion is sort of split up into different tracts, as it was part of the 40,000 acre tract as well as the Craigie tract, so parts that were sort of on the edge of the Holland Purchase and were sort of eventually incorporated, but were their own portions. Now, the name Pavilion actually comes from the village of Pavilion, which was established around 1825 by a man named Herman Betts. Now, he got the name of Pavilion actually from where he had come from, Saratoga in eastern New York, and there was a hotel there called the Pavilion Hotel, so that's where the name comes from. The next town is Pembroke, which was originally known to the Senecas as Oaga, or on the road, which makes sense as Route 5, which was probably the largest Native American trail of its day, ran right through. Now, it's formed from Batavia on June 8, 1812, and it's actually named after the Pembroke in Wales. It originally contained all of Darien and southern Alabama, and included prominent villages of Indian Falls and Corfu. Now, Indian Falls was actually a Native American settlement and was part of the Tonawanda Reservation until 1857, when treaties actually reduced the size of the reservation, and Indian Falls was lost to the reservation and became part of Pembroke. Now, it was originally known by the Senecas as the place of snakes, as there's a large congregation of snakes there and wouldn't be necessarily the best place to go. But it's named after the prominent falls that are along the Tonawanda Creek there. Now, Corfu, one of the other major villages, was originally known as Long's Corners after Dr. David Long, who was a physician who settled in the area, and it was incorporated in 1868. Now, the name Corfu actually goes back to very early history, as it's actually in reference to one of the Greek isles, Corfu. So we've kind of covered, I think, the entire gamut of names here, but we've stretched from ancient history all the way up to, at the time, modern literature. Now, last but not least, as we only went in alphabetical order, is Stafford, which, along with Leroy, can probably boast being one of the earliest places of settlement in Genesee County. Now, it was officially formed on March 24th, 1820, from Leroy and Batavia, basically split half and half, and it was named after the family name of the Duke of Devonshire. Now, Devonshire, England, is actually an area where a lot of these settlers originally came from. Either their families did or they themselves. So it almost makes sense that it would be called Devonshire, named after Devonshire, but the name actually can be referenced to Staffordshire, another part of England. But after some more research, it was found that the Duke of Devonshire, the family name, was actually Stafford. So that's the connection there. Now, in Stafford, it has a prominent place in Genesee County history, as actually was the transit line that runs through Stafford was the eastern boundary of the Holland Purchase. So it was truly the eastern boundary. Now, some of the early settlement goes back to, as we can tell, about 1798, when James Brisbane opened a storehouse there, which was meant to provide supplies for the surveyors of the Holland Land Company. But other early settlers that came very soon after were Frederick Welther, Colonel William Rumsey, and General Worthy Lowell Churchill, which established prominent settlements as early as 1803, but in some cases a few years earlier. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Artifact video series, though we didn't necessarily talk about artifacts, and hope you didn't mind the little change in format that we did for this, and hopefully learned something about our county and our local towns and how they got started, as it's an important piece of our history, and something I always like to study is how do things get their names? So I felt this was a very fun topic for that. But as always, go and check out our YouTube channel, Holland Land Office Museum, and you can find all the rest of our videos. We're nearly at 100 now, and there's plenty of material to read, to watch there as long as you're very much interested. Check out also other videos that we have on there, including our guest speaker series and other presentations. But as always, the best way to come and learn more about Genesee County and the artifacts we have here is to stop by in person. We'll be happy to share more information with you and even more stories that we didn't have time to include in the videos. But until then, we'll see you next week.